The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
South Asia is increasingly vulnerable to climate change. An August report by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change presented an unsettling forecast for the region. Hotter weather, longer monsoon seasons, and increased droughts are predicted as total global warming increases by around 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next 2 decades. From rising sea levels endangering the Maldives, to glacial melts affecting Nepal and Afghanistan, overdevelopment that threatens Tibet's vital ecosystem, and destabilization caused by climate-induced migration, South Asia is facing an environmental watershed. To address these and other pressing climate issues, please join our panelists at this live topical debate, bringing your questions, comments and insights.
Hello, welcome. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, your moderator and host for this timely Democracy Forum debate, South Asia in the throes of an environmental crisis. As we've just seen, from the world's rooftop on the Tibetan plateau and its melting glaciers, to the lowlands of Bangladesh and vanishing coastlines, how can we lessen the impact of this climate and environmental crisis on the lives of hundreds of millions of people? Or is it a crisis? We're going to hear from one speaker how perhaps we should see it through a different lens. But the warnings are catastrophic, from war over access to water to refugees fleeing drought, to the disappearance of the Maldives, the lowest lying country in the world. Because of the importance of this debate coming hard on the heels of the Glasgow Climate Conference, the Democracy Forum has gathered a substantive panel of 6 experts who really know their stuff, although they might not always agree. Shalini, Tempa Gyaltsen Zamlha, Sumit, Naho Mirumachi, Kasia Paprocki, and Tim Forsyth. And summing up, we're lucky to have our own in-house climate and environmental expert, the chair of the Democracy Forum, Barry Gardner MP, who served as his party's climate envoy and was at COP26. But first, let us go to Lord Charles Bruce, Democracy Forum President, who will lay out the grim facts facing South Asia, giving us a canvas on which to debate. Lord Bruce, the screen is yours.
Welcome to our webinar, which has been convened in the wake of the 2021 Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. Our speakers will be addressing the serious consequences of changing weather patterns throughout South Asia, particularly impact on densely populated areas. I thank all our panelists for agreeing to share their insights on such an important issue today. I'm particularly grateful to the team at TDF for giving this topic the priority it clearly deserves and for arranging the forum at such short notice. And our thanks, as always, to Humphrey Hawksley for accepting the role of moderator and giving us the benefit of his deep knowledge of the region. Dramatic evidence of natural disasters triggered by climate change is fast accumulating across the Indian subcontinent and its neighboring countries of South Asia. Our webinar today builds on the panel event which we held earlier in the year in March, which focused on the regional impact of environmental degradation of the Tibetan plateau, describing the cascading effect of its ecological damage. The Dalai Lama made an impassioned plea at the 2015 climate conference in Paris on behalf of the billions of human lives in China, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. This is not a question of one nation or two nations, he said. This is nothing less than the survival of humanity. An emerging consensus of climate modeling now indicates an impending crisis affecting a core group of frontline South Asian states, principally Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Forecasting a rise in temperature for the region of 2 to 4 degrees centigrade within the next 30 years, the scale of economic damage resulting from the combined effects of melting Himalayan glaciers, lethal heat waves, increasing cyclonic activity, and coastal flooding is frankly unimaginable. No longer will the impact be confined to peripheral or rural ecosystems, but increasingly is becoming a fact of life for the majority of the region's city dwellers too. Describing the catastrophic effect of a sudden rush of glacial meltwater in Uttarakhand in February, the Climate Change Programme Director at the Centre for Science and Environment in New Delhi, Samran Sengupta, said, "It's well established that there's a huge impact of climate change on glaciers, and it's on the verge of reaching the tipping point." He continued, "India should be more worried. All our infrastructural investment is based on this perennial river system water supply." No one should be in any doubt about the increasing frequency of natural disasters and the scale of disruption to people's lives. Causing havoc in the space of a few hours, the cyclone Amphan hit Bangladesh and the southeastern states of India in May 2020, and almost exactly a year later, Cyclone Yas repeated the devastation. Over 14 million people were affected. And although 3 million were evacuated from the path of Amphan, over 300,000 homes were destroyed, principally in the densely populated metropolitan areas of Kolkata in the Indian state of West Bengal. The resulting economic damage is estimated to cost $13 billion. The month before Cyclone Yas struck, the government of Pakistan issued frantic warnings of a lethal heatwave as Karachi and its hinterland sweltered in temperatures of over 44 degrees centigrade, the highest recorded since 1947. By 2030, it's estimated over 200 million people living in Indian cities will be forced to endure the frequent and searing experience of heat waves, where undoubtedly the impact will fall very unevenly. Fewer than half the households affected are likely to have access to air conditioning. While the concluding communiques issued by the Glasgow Climate Conference offer South Asian countries a path to reducing the output of greenhouse gases and mitigating the worst effects of rising temperatures and unstable weather, it's an unescapable truth that far too many people living in the region are likely not only to experience the very worst outcomes, but also face very few opportunities to escape the fateful effects. The vulnerability of South Asia's urban poor to climate change was addressed by the fourth assessment of the IPCC in 2007, which noted that the most vulnerable industries, settlements, and societies are generally those in coastal and river floodplains, those whose economies are closely linked with climate-sensitive resources, and those in areas prone to extreme weather events. Poor communities can be especially vulnerable, particularly those concentrated in high-risk areas. And giving an interview to mark the publication of his book, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, the Bengali novelist Amitav Ghosh concludes that the challenges presented by climate change will only be met in the prescribed timeframe by a common commitment and collective action, shared openly, honestly, and evenly between developed and developing worlds. The climate crisis is also a crisis of culture and thus of imagination, he observes. Even if we make all the necessary changes today, these impacts are upon us. They are unfolding on a day-to-day basis all around us. And that's why it's so strange that we only treat this as something that's projected into the future. Well, I keenly await our speakers' presentations and the discussions that will follow. And if you wish to make a point, please feel free to put your questions to the panel.
Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce. Melting Himalayan glaciers, lethal heat waves, cyclonic activity, coastal flooding, yes, unimaginable. Yes, and follow Lord Bruce's guidance. Please challenge us, question us, insist on clarity, use the comments box, and I will feed in your views to the panelists and we will get answers. Our first speaker is Shalini Dhyani, senior scientist with the Critical Zone Research Group and the National Environmental Engineering Research Institute. Shalini plans to focus on growing disaster risks due to climate change and extreme climate events, arguing that ecosystem-based participatory approaches can actually provide better solutions than technological ones. Shalini Dhyani, the floor is yours to explain.
Thank you so much, Humphrey, for having me in this panel. I'm sure the kind of starting that we have, Lord Bruce has already highlighted how much of disaster risk is increasing across this Indian subcontinent and the entire South Asia. Now, I'd like to bring the attention of all the panelists and also all the audience to the recent reports by Global Outlook, by United Nations Environmental Programme, that have already stressed that this entire part of Asia is going to have more serious disastrous risk in the future coming years. Now, climate change is one of them, and this will increase the miserable condition of especially marginalized communities living across South Asia. Now, there was a common perception across the subcontinent that natural resources, natural ecosystems are going to be severely affected by the disaster risk. And rightly pointed out my previous speaker about the Himalayan tsunami that hit Uttarakhand in 2013. Now, going beyond these disasters, the new emerging area is that these disaster risks are, the new centers are the urban areas of South Asia. So it's not only the natural ecosystems, but also the new emerging areas, the fast expanding, unplanned development in urban areas that's going to enhance more disaster risk. So these will be more urban heat islands, more flash floods, more heat waves that will be hitting the urban residents of the country. And this is only going to enhance the vulnerability of the local people and urban residents of this area. It's not only the one thing, disaster in terms of the extreme climate events and vulnerability that is increasing. It's also that increasing population, the exponential rise in population that South Asia is having is also affect a lot of other disasters in making. I'm sure the highlight of Delhi vehicular pollution and the smog is in the media and in the discussions right from the winter time starts in November till January and February. This has been a serious issue for the capital of the country and many other cities in South Asia like Karachi and Bangladesh, Dhaka, and also Nepal that are facing this air pollution impact severely for last almost a few decades. Now, it's vehicular emission, it's also a lot of developmental activities that has resulted Indian subcontinent having some of the nitrogen hotspots in the region. Now, these nitrogen hotspots are going to have a significant impact on the ecosystems and also human well-being of people who are dependent on these ecosystems. So this can be because of vehicular emissions and also agriculture intensification in the region. And there has been almost 50% of the land, geographical land of the region that is devoted for agriculture and agriculture activities. agriculture that's more non-climate adaptive agriculture, that's dependent on groundwater, that is fed by a lot of chemical fertilizers, is also leading and reeling a new kind of disaster for the entire South Asia. Now, summarizing some of these, what I face and I feel that are some of the prominent environmental issues for the region, it's also important to understand that this all will lead to land degradation in the entire region. And when I say land degradation, I must here quote the 2018 report of Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the Asia Pacific Assessment of Ecosystem Services and Biodiversity Assessment, and also land degradation assessment, that clearly shows the way this entire subcontinent is facing land degradation, where China and India are one of the prominent hotspots of land degradation, will lead to more refugees, degradation refugees in coming next 20, 30 years. And these climate refugees have already been, very visible in urban centers of the country. And if I bring this attention to the audience, Uttarakhand, that Lord Bruce also mentioned, is one of the states of the country, India, where there are about 16,000 villages, and almost 2,000 plus villages are right now the ghost villages. People are migrating because of a lot of reasons, leaving these Himalayan villages and migrating to different parts of the country. So the issues have already started reeling up and are already going to be increasing in the severity and vulnerability. Now, one thing is very clear when I talk about South Asia, that we have really less time. The way we are expanding, the way developmental activities are taking place. But at the same time, it's important to understand that ecosystem-based approaches have a very nice, better future. The nature-based solutions have very better future. You talk about natural ecosystems, conserving and protecting and restoring these natural ecosystems, or finding solutions, giving reducing the vulnerability and enhancing the resilience of urban ecosystems. So these ecosystem approaches that have a diverse ways to implement and also enhance community and urban participation of communities can enhance the benefit. Now, when I say nature-based solution, I must also bring this into the discussion, that why I'm not stressing on gray engineering solutions, where there have been a lot of implementation of gray engineering solutions for the mega disasters and mega extreme events, for example, landslides in Himalayas, or the flash floods in the urban areas, or storms and cyclones in the coastal regions. One thing is clear, that these gray engineering solutions cannot be long-term solutions to the country, cannot be the long-term solution for ecosystem restoration and ensuring that communities are protected from severity of these disasters. While nature-based solutions are long-term approaches, but can also provide a lot of co-benefits for the country, a lot of co-benefits to the local communities. These communities are mostly marginalized in nature, and hence the livelihood support, the good carbon stocks, good ecosystem services, especially the cultural benefits, the place-based attachment and nature connectedness are some of these aspects that can be highlighted. Now, where we are lagging because we have more of a public funding coming to these kind of approaches, but there is not significant amount of private financing to these schemes. Even if I talk about climate change, restoration that also addresses livelihood support of the communities can also bring a lot of benefits. So I think as we proceed with this discussion in this panel, I'll be having more opportunities to share more insights on what kind of climate and non-climatic disasters this region is facing, especially the high value but fragile ecosystems of the region, and how communities and people can be involved in bringing more permanent and more sustainable solutions to enhance resilience of communities and ecosystems and reducing the vulnerability of climate change and non-climatic impacts. Thank you so much. I think you're muted. Mr. Humphrey, I think you're mute. You are under mute.
How did that happen? Hi, thank you. Thank you very much. I was taken by the phrase non-climate adapted agriculture, which I think is something everybody's going to have to think about. But could I just quickly clarify one point where you said 16,000 villages in India were now ghost villages? Would that mean very roughly about 16 million people, or how many people would
I was talking about this particular province that Lord Bruce also mentioned, where this Himalayan tsunami happened and resulted in a massive disaster in 2013. So this particular province has about 16,000 villages, and almost 2,000 plus villages are seeing severe migration because of a lot of issues, loss of livelihood, loss of basic amenities and opportunities, and especially because of land degradation in these areas, land degradation because of natural as well as man-made interferences in these regions. And this is also the region where he also mentioned the IPCC report 2007 has highlighted that climate change will lead to more glacier recession and will be more irreversible in nature if we don't plan for more sustainable solutions.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much for that. We're now going to go from there to the Tibetan Plateau and Tempa Gyaltsen Zamlha, who's Deputy Director of the Tibet Policy Institute based here in London and the head of its Environment and Development Desk. We're going to hear from Tempa how the Tibetan Plateau contains the source of Asia's 10 largest and most important rivers, directly feeding into 1.8 billion people in South and Southeast Asia. What happens if that goes wrong? Tempa Gyaltsen Zamlha, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Humphrey. I'm really, really excited to be part of a fantastic group of panelists. And I want to thank the Democracy Forum for focusing on a very urgent and important issue. Now, as stated by the moderator, I would highlight on the ecological importance of the Tibet Plateau to South Asia. And I will try to do that by focusing on four important aspects of the Tibet Plateau. Now, the Tibet Plateau is called the roof of the world, the third pole, the rainmaker, and finally the water tower of Asia. Now, this four aspect clearly indicates its importance to the region. Now, why is Tibet Plateau called the roof of the world? Now, Tibet Plateau occupies 2.5 million square kilometers of area, which is almost 2% of Earth's land surface. Now, what that makes? That makes Tibet Plateau, if it's an independent state, had it not been occupied by China, it would have been the 10th largest country by size. And now this massive surface area of 2.5 million square kilometers stands at a very high elevation of 4,000 meters above sea level and at an average elevation. Now that means the Tibet Plateau stands as high as the highest mountains in Europe and other countries, which also means that the foot height of any mountain on the plateau would start from 4,000 meters. That's why if you Google, you would find most of the mountains rising above 7,000 meters would be found on the Tibet Plateau. Which means scientifically the Tibet Plateau is considered to be the highest and the largest plateau ever existed in the geological history of the Earth. Now, this roof of the world, because of its high elevation, as I stated, and also because of its massive surface area, it has become home to 46,000 glaciers, which means it is the third largest. It is home to third largest store of ice after the North Pole and South Pole. But what happens with the glaciers present on the North Pole and South Pole? When they melt into the ocean, and it leads to sea level rise, and that leads to puts the small island at risk. But the glaciers, 46,000 glaciers present on the Tibet Plateau, when they melt become or feed hundreds of rivers that originate from the Tibet Plateau and flow across Asia. Now, because of the massive presence of glaciers on the plateau, the Tibet Plateau is also called the third pole. And this term third pole, there's a very interesting story to it. The term third pole was first used by a Swiss explorer, mountaineer, who after exploring most of the European mountains, it was time in Europe when they had the money, the curiosity and the knowledge to explore mountains. So he traveled to the Himalayas, and after reaching at the base of Mount Everest, he was astonished with the massive glacier present there. That's when he said, "This must be Earth's third pole." And his friend Dhyani, who sponsored the very expedition to the Himalayas, brought out a book titled "To the Himalayas: History of the High." To the third pole, History of High Himalayas in 1955. So that is when the term third pole was officially used in a book. But for the Tibetans, we always knew that we are land of snow. So if you go back to in the Tibetan historical text, Tibetans call themselves as people of land of snow, and as early as 7th century. And we also pride ourselves as snowland paradise. So we always knew that we live on one of the most glaciated land. Now, because of the massive presence of glaciers, and also because its high elevation and massive surface area, as it occupies 2% of Earth's landmass, the Tibet Plateau also influences climate conditions across Asia. Now, it is also because of its high elevation, the temperature rise on the plateau is twice or occasionally thrice more than the global average. Now, because of the massive presence of glaciers as well as the intense temperature rise on the plateau, it has been influencing the climate conditions across Asia. And according to scientific paper, they have found that the timing and the intensity of Indian monsoon is greatly influenced by the atmospheric temperature on the plateau. And also a recent report published in 2015 has found that there's a strong link between the increasing cases of heat waves in Europe to the loss of glaciers on the plateau. And another report, scientific report, published in 2014, also found another strong link between North America and the Tibet Plateau. Now, the paper states that greater the snow cover in Tibet, the warmer it is in Canada. So the climate influence that Tibetan Plateau exerts extend as not only across Asia, but also as far as Europe and North America. That's why a very famous atmospheric scientist named V. Ramanathan, who have rightly said that our understanding of global climate change would be incomplete without taking into consideration what's happening on the Tibet Plateau. So that is why we here at the Tibetans in exile, we have participated at UN Climate Summit since 2009 and tried to highlight the importance of the Tibet Plateau and its possible implication for any damage or destruction of the plateau to the millions of people in Asia and also in Europe and North America. And that's why since 2050 at the COP21, we have put forth something called 5-point call to action, in which we have clearly asked UN climate delegates to recognize the global ecological importance of the Tibet Plateau and make Tibet Plateau central to any global climate change discussion. Now, coming to the fourth point, Tibet as the water tower of Asia. Now, because of massive presence of glaciers on the plateau, as well as its high elevation and the massive also presence of permafrost, Tibetan Plateau is head source of Asia's largest rivers, as Lord Charles and also Humphrey stated in their opening remarks. So many of you who may or may not have been able to travel to Tibet because of its current occupation under Chinese occupation. But if you have traveled to any part of Asia, say if you have traveled to Pakistan or Bangladesh, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, China, or India, you are never far from Tibetan rivers. Say in Pakistan, two most important rivers in Pakistan, Indus and Satluj, both originate from the Tibet Plateau, and most of the North Indian rivers, Satluj, Kanali, and Brahmaputra, all originate from the Tibet Plateau. Two most important rivers in Southeast Asia, Mekong River and Selvi River, both originate from the Tibet Plateau. And the two most important rivers which run parallel to each other from west to east across China, Yellow River in north and Yangtze River in south, both originate from the Tibet Plateau. So these rivers, 10 most important rivers in Asia, sustain 1.8 billion people directly, and indirectly almost 40% of world population is somewhere or other supported by Tibetan rivers. So, and also historically, some of the most important civilizations that we know of, such as the Indus civilization and the Yellow in India and Pakistan, and the Yellow civilization in China, all flourished on rivers originating from the Tibet Plateau. And the Tibetan rivers continue to sustain livelihood across Asia. But unfortunately, because of climate change to some extent, and also because of destructive policies, destructive development projects, and also wrong policies by the Chinese government, there has been increasing cases of landslides, mud floods, and destructive river water pollution on the Tibet Plateau. In case of climate change, like any part of the world, the impact of climate change is strongly felt on the Tibet Plateau, particularly since 2050. We have observed that Tibet Plateau has experienced unprecedented number of natural disasters since 2015, such as landslides, floods, forest fire, a glacier avalanche. And that is because of its, to some extent, because of its high elevation, and to some extent because of its, the location of the Tibetan Plateau to the close proximity to Tropic of Cancer. Now, two examples would highlight the seriousness of climate change and its impact. Tibetan Plateau experienced two landslides in 2018. One on the 11th October 2018, which blocked Asia's longest river for 11 days. A massive landslide in Tibet blocked the Dichu River, as we call in Tibet, or the Yangtze River, the longest river in Asia, or the third longest river in the world, for 11 days. Can you imagine? Now, fortunately, this blockage of the river for 11 days happened in the early winter, which means at the time when the river flow is gradually receding. And then around the same time, on the 17th October 2018, another landslide or glacier-related landslide blocked Gyaltsen or the Brahmaputra, the longest river in Western Tibet, or the most important river in India or Bangladesh, for one whole day. Fortunately, both of these events, as I stated, happened in early winter, or at the time when the river flow is on the decline. But the implication could have been serious. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but this is a clear indication what could happen in the coming years. And now the situation is further aggravated by increasing construction of dams by the Chinese government in the recent years. There has been more than 350 dams being built on the Tibet Plateau in the last 50 years, and there's an increasing trend of building mega dams on the Tibetan rivers. And the dams also could induce seismic activities, and also landslides and displacement of villages and other settlements. And also, there has been increasing cases of river water pollution, and also increasing cases of garbage. And most seriously, there has been a destructive form of resource extraction across the plateau. And also, there has been increasing cases of arrests of Tibetan environmentalists on the plateau. So, to conclude, as His Holiness has said in a message sent to at the COP21 during the Paris Climate Summit, that this blue planet is our only home, and Tibet is roof. Since Tibet is the only roof that we have, the Tibetan people, the Chinese government, and the international community can and should work together for the protection of this Tibet plateau, for the welfare of Tibetans in Tibet, of course, and for the welfare of millions or the billions of people across Asia. With that, I would conclude. Thank you very much.
Tempa, thank you very much for that rather startling account there of the how vital this Tibetan plateau area is. There's a question come in from Ajay Pratap Singh Rathore, which I'm going to put up on the screen there. I wonder if you can give me a very, very quick answer to it. It's almost a yes or no answer. And then I hope that our next speaker, Dr. Sumit Vij, also addresses it. Given the antipathy that exists between some South Asian countries, why don't we say Asian countries, if you don't mind, Ajay, how realistic is it to expect regional collaboration on climate environmental issues? Is it realistic or is it not realistic, Tempa?
It is necessary, but it's not coming out as realistic at the moment, but it is necessary, I would say.
It's necessary. So we need that collaboration if we're going to get progress. Great, because we are now moving to Dr. Sumit Vij, a postdoctoral researcher at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And his studies include policy making in South Asia around climate and water. And he's looked especially closely at India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. And in the trade, that's known as transboundary water politics. So Dr. Sumit Vij, tell us what you know.
Thank you, Humphrey, for inviting me and giving this opportunity to share. I'm just waiting for the slides to come up. Yeah. Yes, thank you, Vineet. I will be a bit provocative to start with, and my first argument is I'll end my argument with this, is that whether this environmental crisis, which is also part of the larger water crisis in South Asia, will it turn into a water war? Because there has been a lot of debates in the last at least two and a half decades that we will get to see water wars. It's starting from the Middle East, and maybe South Asia is one of the hot spots for that. I'm going to challenge that and maybe potentially answer this question. But before we go there, we have to understand why South Asia as a water resource is so important. Of course, Tempa and also Humphrey, you both kind of positioned it quite well, that the four big rivers, or at least the major rivers in South Asia, emerge from the Tibetan plateau, and they almost are responsible for feeding 2 billion people in the region. But this also comes with the argument that this demand for energy and food is increasing, and there's this sense of resource scarcity narrative which is kind of coming along this in the last 1 decade or so. But apart from that, there's also another narrative which is about the security which the state is very much worried about. And sometimes, or I would say quite a few times in South Asia, water gets mingled with this narrative of security around the state, which becomes quite an element of urgency and emergency, and it becomes part of this larger panic politics. This whole angle of securitization is very delicate to handle, and sometimes this leads to this very strong narrative that there will be a water war happening in South Asia. And this also influences the larger discourse on climate change and other environmental issues in South Asia. But if we have to look very carefully, what we also see is that there are certain institutional arrangements around transboundary rivers, especially if we talk about Indus, which is a bone of contention, always discussed when India and Pakistan are at loggerheads with each other. We always see that this particular Indus Water Treaty has survived 3 wars, which is a very interesting case of cooperation in some ways. However, if we look at past historical issues around transboundary rivers, especially around Brahmaputra, Ganges, and the Indus, these are always hindered by socio-economic and political interests. And this leads to border issues or territorial issues, the infrastructure, the construction of dams, and now we are also seeing this rise of nationalism and populistic arguments. And kind of South Asia is now being ruled by these alpha male leaders, which desire to show that each country is strong enough to protect their territory, which sometimes is not very useful standby. And when Tempa said that it is necessary that these countries come together, but it is difficult, or it looks unlikely, it's potentially because of the style of leadership which we are seeing in South Asia in the recent past. But apart from that, what we have noticed is that water is becoming a pawn to this multidimensional conflict in the region. We have seen what has happened in Afghanistan recently when Taliban attacked the Friendship Dam, which was constructed by India. And we know how Pakistan and India relationships were. And this was specifically attacked by Taliban to show that we are not going to support India. And the diplomatic ties are at strain right now, especially between India and Afghanistan. The second example we can look at is that when in 2016 there was an attack on a military base in India, there was clear, very strong argument by the Prime Minister in India showcasing that blood and water cannot flow simultaneously, which is a very strong narrative, and it shows the sign of conflicts around that. But I have to also carefully argue around this particular part is that the water is becoming part of this larger militarization of the area where the water flows. And so we have to be careful that not always water will turn into water conflicts. My next slide, I clearly make an argument that there will be no water wars in South Asia. There will be always water conflicts. There will be politics which shapes water conflicts and also cooperation in South Asia, but there will be no water wars. So I want to be very clear, especially this kind of fear mongering is not good, especially when we are living in these difficult and uncertain times with COVID and all these scenarios. I think it's also useful for us to not promote false narrative of water wars. And it is damaging in itself because it's instead of militarizing this water scarcity aspect, we should rather focus on the narrative that we produce our own scarcity. We have to look into the management and the governance aspects of it. And following that, when we saw that India and China are currently in a kind of a territorial conflict, or a territorial scuffle is going on since 2020, there was a slight window where both the heads of the state came together and they discussed that we should continue data sharing on the river Brahmaputra, the Yalong Sangpo, as Tempa was mentioning. And that became a very interesting point of cooperation in this large gamut of water conflicts. So I would also say that sometimes water also opens the door for cooperation between the two countries. So we always don't have to look at the conflicts part of it. Lastly, to summarize, my arguments are that we really need to look at the strategies of cooperation to pull South Asia out from these frozen conflicts. We have, at least in the last 7 decades, after the subcontinent got independent, there has been these territorial and border issues, and there are these frozen conflicts around these border areas, and water becomes particularly pawn to these conflicts. I think we need to locate strategies. There has been success on when we shared islands between India and Bangladesh that helped us. I think we can also follow that for transboundary rivers. The second is to look into the nuts and bolts around the governance and management of transboundary natural resources, especially around transboundary rivers. I think the new Delta Plan 2100 in Bangladesh focuses a large part of it on transboundary waters. I think we need similar initiatives in the water policies in other countries. The new or the draft version of the water policy in India also has a bigger focus on this. We are particularly pushing for more multilateral negotiations instead of bilateral negotiations. So that could be a game changer there. And the last one, I think it's very important, is to look at these informal tracks of diplomacy and dialogue. And they are powerful tools. For two examples, very quickly, one is on the Brahmaputra. I've been part of this Brahmaputra dialogue for almost now 8 years. And we have seen that transition of how trust building happens between the actors at track 3 and track 2 level. And when I say track 3 and track 2, they don't include always the ministers and highest level of bureaucrats, but also the media, of how media projects, media personalities, the journalists, the academics, if they come together, work together, and kind of take away all these myths around the rivers, transboundary rivers. I think that really helps. The other important element within that is to look into this whole element of science media diplomacy. We as academics sometimes are very difficult to understand. Humphrey was just mentioning about that. I think if we have this strong science media diplomacy, I think this could also help us to take out the world in terms of presenting the science in a very simple way, reduce or remove some of these myths around transboundary rivers, especially rivers which are less researched, such as the Yarlung Sangbo, because of the securitization issues. I'm going to stop here, but that's what I wanted to speak about, the issue of environmental crisis and how water crisis is being framed in South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sumit Vij. I just wanted to clarify where this discussion is. And we've got two parallel things that seem to be merging. We have the climate change issue, and we have the water issue, which has been around for a long time, and the conflict over that. But is it the case that they're sort of merging into one environmental, climate, water issue now, or are they still separate?
I think I must say that there's still kind of parallel arguments going around that. But now water and climate are coming very close to each other. And when we talk about these water conflicts, they also reflect that there is a strong climate conflict which might emerge. And I think that's where the connection between water and climate comes.
Right. Which brings me to a question from Peter Cornish. I'm going to throw this to you, then the panel can think about it, and our next speaker as well. The links between climate change, and I'm going to put water in there, and security. Can the US, China, and other powerful nations alleviate the effects of climate change, water, whatever, to ensure a free and secure Indo-Pacific?
I think it's a fair thought, but I must say that the issue is very regional in nature, and it cannot be just done by resolving this whole US-China issue. There's India, there's Bangladesh, there's Sri Lanka, there's Afghanistan. There's a lot many other countries who have a lot bigger say in the region, and I think that needs to come. The region has to come together. We have different types of, I must say, forums like the SARC, which is not very functional now. I think they have to become powerful. They have to strengthen themselves to really resolve these regional issues before going to larger global issues.
Okay, so this is a crisis, although our next speaker is going to say maybe it isn't, but this is a situation that is really at the grassroots, where villages on borders and people that share rivers actually have to get together and sort it out.
Yes.
Great. So we are now going to go to, I like this argument, if I'm correct, Naho Mirumachi, Associate Professor in Environmental Politics at King's College London, and she has published widely on water conflicts and water politics in South Asia, and will be warning us about seeing things through the lens of a crisis. So if we don't do that, how should we see it? Naho Mirumachi, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. I'm in fantastic company. I've been taking lots of notes as I've been listening to the other speakers. And they've kind of done a little bit of my job in many ways, because in the next 8 minutes or so, I was going to make 2 points to be clear and concise short and sweet, but I think it's now 1.5 points. But what I want to start off as my first point is to say that the water challenges and the environmental crisis in a more broader context of South Asia is very varied. It's not a homogeneous environmental crisis. If you look at places like Afghanistan, you've seen in the news not just what happened during this summer, but also now with lots of issues around drought and food. We've also had repeated average of flooding that has happened. So you have situations of too much water, too little water. In many parts of the region, we see also an issue of not just water quantity, but water quality. So I think it was very pertinent what Tempa mentioned about things happening in Tibet, about the ways in which it's not just about the third pole having issues around glacier melt, but it's also about pollution. It's also about water quality that is becoming an issue. And Shalini has also pointed out the issue of groundwater as well. In many parts of South Asia, it's not just about surface water, but also groundwater that is really being extracted and becoming an environmental issue. Layered on top of this, as Humphrey mentioned, the issue of climate and water is very intricate and very interconnected now, because we can't really talk about how water situations are changing in terms of its quantity or quality without mentioning climate change. But the question, I think, is, first of all, asking what is the water being used for, and why is it an environmental crisis? What exactly is the nature of the environmental crisis, especially in a region where a lot of countries are labeled as fragile or conflict-affected states, and people can disagree, argue about this labeling, but it's also seen as a very fragile, politically unstable, many kind of political ideologies sort of being tested out in the region as well. So I want to really focus in on water and what water is being used for in a very complex, climate-wise, politically-wise, a complex region. And I want to sort of shed light on the role of agriculture, because agriculture is the biggest water user in the region. I'm going to specifically mention India, for example. Oh, I hear a note saying that people are having problems hearing me. Are you able to hear me?
I can hear you perfectly now.
Okay.
So
all right.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll keep going. But if people have trouble hearing me, please just let me know again. But as I mentioned, agriculture is the biggest water user. And if I take the example of India, this is a very pertinent example, because India is the second global farm output producing country. It's the second largest producer of wheat and rice in the world. It's the third largest virtual water exporter. By virtual water, I'm talking about all the water that's used to produce food and t-shirts that are made of cotton, for example. There's a lot of water in producing these items and food products, and India is one of the largest, the top 3 in the world, in providing these water intensive products throughout the world. And places like Britain, places like Europe really benefit from countries like this. But it does mean that the agricultural water use is draining on other purposes, for example, drinking water. So right now, water is recognized as a human right. And we're now in the 11th year of water recognized as a human right throughout the world. But on one hand, we have a huge amount of water being used for agricultural output, but then basic rights such as drinking water and sanitation are being talked about or not discussed in detail. And so this goes to my second point about the fact that there are some dangers in talking about the environmental crisis if we understand that water is being used largely for agricultural use. If we understand how there is a systematic problem of human rights being undermined around water, drinking water, and sanitation, then we are absolving the states from their responsibilities in delivering these basic human rights. If we just assume that this is an environmental crisis that's hampered by climate change, by difficult climate, by difficult geography, by precarious rainfall, by the way the river flows in and out, difficult terrain, then we are actually taking away the responsibilities of states to deliver on their promise to their citizens. The point that I make actually draws on a study that was commissioned by the European Parliament. This is now in the public domain, so I'm very happy to share the details of it. But it reviewed the state of agribusinesses and the impact of large-scale agriculture, the impact of abstractive industries such as mining on the human right to water in different parts of the world, including India. And what was very striking about this particular case in South Asia is that in many cases, water is being used in large quantities by agribusinesses. States have a legal obligation to provide for their citizens on their human rights to drinking water and sanitation, but businesses do not. They do not have a legal responsibility. And so it's very important to think about how can we ensure, how can we equip the states to be able to monitor, to be able to regulate these businesses that are using vast quantities of water at the expense of these basic human rights. And I think this is one of the key points that I think we need to keep in mind, that if we just assume that this is a natural phenomenon, if we just assume that this is a purely environmental, as if it was not related to the structural constraints of society, why are people marginalized from accessing basic drinking water services? This is not purely environmental. This has a lot to do with class. It has a lot to do with race. It has a lot to do with the socioeconomic political conditions that people are in. And so if we think about the ways in which we want to tackle this water crisis that's being pressured by climate change, for example, I don't think we can just look at water per se, drinking water or sanitation per se. We need to think about the ways in which drinking water is related to agriculture. We need to think about the ways in which laws are set up to look at businesses and account businesses and their reporting on environmental burdens, for example. That needs to be better regulated. And I think there needs to be a much more holistic way in which we talk about the structural constraints that people face. So rather than just saying that, the Indian subcontinent is facing an environmental crisis, actually it's a livelihood crisis. It's also an issue of consistent political marginalization. It's about the ways in which people are stripped of citizenship. It's about the ways in which people struggle to claim ownership and assess their rights over property and land, etc. So I warn against this notion of just throwing out a blanket claim about things being environmental, things being just a climate issue, even though it's grave and urgent. There are actually some very fundamental, very, very complex socioeconomic political conditions that we have to analyze much more critically and hold our states into account. Thank you very much.
I'm delighted at the way the narrative arc of this discussion is going, in a way, because I mean, we've all fresh in our minds around the world about the climate debate, and we're getting into something that the water debate here, which you really nailed down, Naho, beautifully, actually. But I think my thought is this: is that are they the same thing, or do we think about them differently? In climate, for example, we were all told about the 1.5 degree sort of tipping point or benchmark. Is there something in water that is mentioned in this debate, as we mustn't go further than this in this sort of rivalry or conflict?
Equivalent in the water sector, but you don't have water to drink, if you don't have a safe place to go to the loo, especially as a woman, I would be terrified. This has nothing to do with numbers. It is about my dignity, about my safety in having a healthy life, in having a risk-free toilet situation. And I think that's already iconic. I don't think we need a number to mention that. That
so
in itself is, I think, striking.
Yeah. So in these societies, this issue of water is far more important than the issue of climate. I think you're.
Oh, Humphrey, I think you cut out there.
Yeah, I think you cut out too. I think Barry Gardner was right. There's something dodgy with your acoustics. Try again.
What was your question, Humphrey?
Oh, the question is that if you live in this environment in South Asia, the climate debate is very far removed from your water debate. The water debate's the number one priority, isn't it?
I think people are faced with these water challenges every day. I don't think people talk of climate change as a 1.5 degree issue. I think it's very much interspersed with the way they see the river change, the way the groundwater levels are changing, the way the longer distances they have to go and fetch water, the ways in which they have to change their cropping patterns. So I don't think it's I don't think it's a formalized sort of way of saying this is a water issue and this is a climate issue. I think it's very much interspersed with the everyday fabric.
Right. And can I put to you the question from Sandhu Negi that has just come in, slightly off tangent, but it's an important question. In the wake of the ongoing COVID pandemic, how can we protect natural environments to reduce the risk of disease outbreaks? Very important given the conversation we were just having.
Yes, I think this is a great question. And I think one of the key debates that have been ongoing is how do we ensure a healthy ecosystem? Because that's actually what protects many of issues like disease outbreaks, as well as livelihoods. And so I think there's a renewed interest in looking at healthy planets, healthy environments for healthy lives of humans as well.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. We are now going to Dr. Kasia Paprocki from the London School of Economics, who's an expert in political ecology, social movements, and agrarian change, with a laser-like eye on Bangladesh. Her latest publication examines the political ecology of climate change in coastal Bangladesh. So, Kasia Paprocki, tell us what you found out.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be on this very interesting panel, and I think, in particular, I'm really excited about how the work that I've been doing myself builds on some of the thoughts that other speakers have shared. In particular, I think it's great to be following Drs. Vij and Mirumachi, who have asked sort of similar questions today about the dangers of naturalizing the impacts of climate change instead of understanding them in their sort of social, political, and historical context. So yeah, as you've heard, my work is primarily focused in Bangladesh, where I've worked for about 15 years now in rural communities on questions related to development, ecological change, and climate change adaptation. In the time I have today, the key message I'd like to convey in my comments is about the problems with climate crisis rhetoric and the corresponding responsibilities of countries of the global north in addressing the challenges that countries in the global south, including across South Asia, are facing. And this is a key theme in my book, Threatening Dystopias, which is actually just published today by Cornell University Press officially. Okay, so first I want to talk about how dangerous discourses about climate crisis can be for communities who are seen to be most at risk. And here I'll talk just a little bit about what that looks like for communities in rural coastal Bangladesh. So Bangladesh has widely been referred to as the most vulnerable country to climate change, which has made it subject to both intensive development intervention as well as intensive research on the impacts of climate change among the local and international scientific community. Now, these discourses surrounding climate crisis have both resulted from and produced a kind of common sense about how Bangladesh's coastal landscape is transforming. You may have seen images of catastrophic climate impacts in Bangladesh depicting erosion and flooding. For example, the one that we saw in the opening video, which sort of suggests that the region is already in the physical process of being wiped off the map as a direct result of climate change. Now, these discourses further suggest that the disappearance of land in this coastal region is essentially inevitable due to climate-induced sea level rise. These narratives have real effects, not least because they shape interventions in the region for climate change adaptation. If climate crisis is thought to be inevitable, then the strategies for addressing it are different. For example, land loss due to climate change leads to policy projections for the need for massive relocation of coastal communities, whereas land loss due to faulty engineering interventions may lead to policies for alternative design and maintenance of existing infrastructures. The truth is that many of the most severe impacts of ongoing ecological change in the region today are the result of development interventions that have exacerbated conditions of social and ecological insecurity in Bangladesh's coastal region. For example, much of the problem with soil salinity is the result of the production of shrimp, most of which is exported to the UK, EU, and the United States. Similarly, many existing problems with sea level rise are actually the result of what's known as relative sea level rise, which means that the land is literally sinking. Now, this is the result of a deeply flawed system of coastal embankments that were built in the 1960s with US and Dutch finance and engineering expertise. Insufficient maintenance of these embankments increases threats to these communities by increasing the risk that they will be breached during the cyclonic storm surges that we also heard about before. So in response to this sense of inevitable crisis, many development agencies have responded with strategies that reframe problems as solutions, and which in turn further entrench vulnerability and the inequitable distribution of resources. So for example, shrimp aquaculture is increasingly referred to as a climate change adaptation strategy, further exacerbating the vulnerability of communities to its ecological impacts. Similarly, the threat of climate migrants out of this region resulting from these environmental changes has stoked xenophobic rhetoric both on the other side of the border in India as well as in the global north, including in the United Kingdom. This is certainly linked with the critique of securitizing discourses of water wars that we just heard about from Dr. Vij. So while this is just a very sort of cursory overview of a few different ecological challenges facing the region, it gives you some sense of how the ongoing threats to the region are actually not inevitable and have also never been so. They're instead the result of unequal social relations that are in an ongoing state of formation. The key point here is that climate change adaptation produces winners and losers, and that the specific impacts experienced and how they are unequally distributed is not inevitable. Instead, who loses and who benefits from these ongoing processes is mediated by historical and existing systems of power. My second point is that despite these profoundly global political dynamics shaping environmental vulnerability today, local political movements in Bangladesh have their own complex understandings of ecological change that we can learn from, as well as alternative visions of the future despite the threat of climate change. So, for example, many local communities in the coastal region have mobilized to demand land rights and greater self-determination in land use. For example, for a return to agricultural production, moving away from these commercial shrimp exports that I mentioned earlier. And while many development agencies have promoted shrimp production in recent years based on the claim that it's the only option available due to inevitable increases in soil salinity, these movements demonstrate alternative possibilities for ongoing agrarian livelihoods. So, as an alternative to catastrophic visions of climate crisis, engaging with these complex political economic concerns, such as land rights, can lead to different opportunities for imagining and pursuing climate justice. Peasant movements and other environmental movements in Bangladesh and across South Asia often have very well-developed perspectives on environmental politics, which frequently conflict with international visions of environmental politics and perspectives on what makes Bangladesh vulnerable to climate change. These movements often have clear demands and concerns, and these demands can be an important resource for thinking about what climate justice could look like in Bangladesh, as well as in other parts of the world. And finally, my third point, I want to talk about the responsibilities of countries of the global north in addressing these ongoing threats. What is clear from the two examples I described earlier related to the causes of threats currently facing Bangladesh's coastal region is that they're not only based on social relations that are both historical and being actively produced today, but that importantly, these social relations are fundamentally global. And this is a political dynamic that dates back to the colonial period. The region that is now coastal Bangladesh has been subjected to an ongoing process of social and physical engineering since the colonial period that has profoundly shaped the vulnerability of communities inhabiting it. It's important to recognize the impacts of this colonial history in the present as we confront questions about responsibilities for addressing it. So, for example, the legacy of colonialism has caused profoundly unequal regimes of land control. And in the absence of land reform, this inequality has persisted today. While some social movements have worked to draw attention to how this inequality has exacerbated vulnerability to future climate threats, international development and adaptation finance has rarely, if ever, addressed it. Ignoring the role of these political and economic inequalities in shaping vulnerability today undermines possibilities for addressing these systemic threats. So a question that I want to leave you with today, just in closing then, is how can the UK join forces with Bangladesh to think about the impacts of this colonial legacy and to address it, not as a matter of charity, but as a matter of reparations for historical harms that persist in the present and will continue in the future? Thank you.
Kasia, thank you. That's a big question. As the reparations of Britain's colonial past. But there's interesting, these sort of phrases that are coming out now: social inequalities, climate justice, the absence of land reform, and we heard about climate adapted agriculture earlier on. I've got a lot of questions for you, but we haven't got the time, but I'd like to put to you a question from Rimjin Sud. Was COP26 that you've mentioned the global north a lost opportunity for wealthier countries to help developing nations tackle climate challenges? A lost opportunity, is that correct?
Yeah, I think that it's certainly a lost opportunity, although also I think that in general, the global climate finance regime has been a lost opportunity, not only for thinking about a more sort of equitable distribution of climate finance between countries, but also within countries. And so a lot of what I just talked about are sort of harms that are related not only to global inequalities, but also to national scale inequalities that have been sort of supported and entrenched by these global regimes of climate finance. And so I think that while, you know, a lot of members of the least developed countries negotiating bloc have said that COP26 was a lost opportunity for sort of shifting more resources from the global north to the global south, I think that it's not only necessary to get those resources to the global south, but then also to think more critically about how they're distributed within those countries.
Is the debate become too simplistic? I mean, reading the sort of headlines from the US and Britain, you know, this thing about the 1.5 degrees, that the Xi Jinping didn't turn up to the to the thing, the coal, whether coal is used or not used. Is that really meaningful to the people that you've researched with in Bangladesh?
I mean, listen, it's absolutely necessary for us to mitigate the impacts of climate change, right? I mean, in the future, we're going to see these threats that I'm discussing being exacerbated much, much more, both because of this sort of historical and political context that I'm talking about today, and also because we will see growing climate threats in the future, and especially if we don't start mitigating the impacts of climate change and stopping emitting carbon into the atmosphere now, immediately. But I think that, there are sort of two planes of politics, more than two. There are many, many multi-scalar politics of climate change. And I think that limiting them to saying, all we need to do is stop emitting carbon and then everything else will fall into place is really not addressing the sort of complex political economy of capitalism, which not only drives the continued production of carbon and emission of carbon into the atmosphere, but also shapes the way that the impacts of those emissions are experienced today in particular communities.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's great, because that takes us nicely into our final speaker. By the way, congratulations on the book. Do you have a copy that you can show us? Where can we all buy it?
You know what? It's so funny. I hear that people in the US are already receiving it, and I haven't seen it myself. But I guess you can buy it on Amazon and all that.
Amazon. Give us the title again.
It's called Threatening Dystopias.
Threatening Dystopias. My goodness, sounds like a Hollywood movie. But let's hope it becomes a box office hit. And the discussion that we sort of teased out just now takes us very nicely into our final speaker, Professor Tim Forsyth from the London School of Economics. And his many areas of expertise include the climate debate in developing countries. But with Democracy Forum today, he's going to tackle this apparently insoluble challenge that we just touched on the continual use of coal and how to stop it. Tim Forsyth, can that be done?
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the statement of Alok Sharma at the end of COP26 when he announced this new initiative to phase out coal. And I'm going to be making three main points about this. So the main message is that at the COP26, the final day, that Alok Sharma, who is the chair of the conference, makes this announcement that there has been a new initiative where there were a total of 190 countries and organizations, which, by the way, turns out to be 23 countries, have announced the desire to phase out coal. But there was this challenge on the last day because India and China didn't want to use the words phase out. They wanted to use the words phase down. And this was considered to be a big disappointment. And Alok Sharma said something like China and India now need to explain themselves to the rest of the world as to why they're not willing to phase out coal. So what I'm going to do is to make three comments about all of this. The first one is that Alok Sharma should really do some history. In 1992, when the climate change negotiations started, when the convention was signed and other things like Agenda 21 was signed, all of these agreements included commitments by the richer countries to help poorer countries with technology transfer. In fact, it was actually a condition of the poorer countries signing up that there would be a clause saying that we, the richer countries, will actually assist poorer countries in transforming their industry and adopting cleaner, environmentally sound technologies. Now, what has happened ever since then is that there hasn't been much progress in that. And every year there's a meeting, and every year India and China in particular complain that the richer countries haven't met their commitments towards performing technology transfer. Now, the problem here is that the early commitments were actually very difficult to achieve. If you actually look at the text in the Climate Change Convention, it's committing the richer countries to basically giving technology to the poorer countries. But unfortunately, that's what was written. That was what was written in the agreements, more or less. And consequently, there's been very little constructive debate since about how to get beyond that sort of initial problem with the poorer countries demanding technologies and the rich ones saying, well, actually, it's difficult. The point is that there hasn't been enough discussion about how to transform away from dirty fuel or towards cleaner energies. In particular, technologies there's a big blind spot about this. It's very interesting, for example, that Al Gore, who's considered by many people to be a leader in climate change negotiations, doesn't really talk about technology transfer. You know, just look at what he says. And a lot of people suggest that's largely because for the US political situation, to talk about technology transfer, to talk about helping China and India industrialize, is a little bit too close to saying that you're going to export jobs from the USA to these other competing developing countries. Anyway, the point is that we need more discussion about how to do it. And I don't think it's acceptable for people to say, we will just agree to phase it out without also engaging in a very constructive dialogue about how to do so and how to help these countries. There are a number of challenges because it's actually very difficult, because technology is not something you just give to people. It's owned by the private sector. There have to be incentives for the private sector. There have to be safeguards against intellectual property. It can't be done quickly. There has to be done with local engagement over a period of time. There are all sorts of factors that have to be done. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is for India, right? It's a complex issue. Coal in India is a huge, huge embedded industry and lifestyle, and also a source of political power. You don't simply get away from coal by signing an agreement to say, I'm going to phase out coal. You need to engage at multiple levels with multiple people. So, for example, the general market of electricity in India is crazily dependent on coal. About 80% of power generation comes from coal. And what's interesting is that power generation is still about 9% below the actual peak demand. So there's quite regular blackouts because they can't supply the demand. Now, the point is that under those conditions, any poorer country that wants to grow its economy will want to grow its power generation. And therefore, it's not really interested in saying, well, let's get rid of our main source of power, unless there's actually some sort of dialogue about how to do so. It's not just reducing the coal, it's also reducing the demand for electricity. Now, there have been a number of initiatives, for example, on reducing incandescent light bulbs. Incandescent light bulbs use about 90% of their electricity in heat, you know, let alone the lights. They're very inefficient. Now, there have been some schemes to get rid of this stuff, but we need to do much more of this sort of thing. We need to work out ways to make energy demand more efficient and therefore reduce the demand for electricity, which will reduce the demand for coal. Also, crucially, there's a huge amount of poorer people who depend upon coal for fuel, but also as a form of selling fuel to get a livelihood. In some of the coal-dependent states, like Jharkhand in the north of India, there are certain cities like Dhanbad, for example, which are dependent upon coal. And in the whole state, there could be like 300,000 people who depend on selling coal illegally as a way of getting a livelihood. And by that, I mean that they get access to coal, sometimes through waste, which they sell on the streets. And sometimes children are involved selling this. And again, if you get rid of coal, you're going to affect those people's livelihoods. You need to build alternative livelihoods and factor them into the equation. But also another challenge is that there are so many political reasons and economic reasons that the states like Odisha and West Bengal get a lot of state revenue from managing the coal. And getting taxes from the coal generation and the coal use. And therefore, if you're going to reduce the coal, you're going to reduce the power of the states. The local states don't really have the interest in changing their involvement in coal. That has to be addressed. Meanwhile, there's all this world of alternative energies like renewable energies and the rest, and that has to be looked at, and all that's another area to look at. So my second point is about the complexity of coal and what needs to be done, and a lot needs to be done. So my third and final point is to talk about how the discussion generally in climate change at the moment, and indeed today's discussion is an example, is to talk more and more about nature-based solutions. Our previous speaker, Shalini Dhyani, spoke about this, for example. Now, nature-based solutions are based on the idea that if we do something about restoring ecosystems, then that will solve multiple problems. And to be clear, there are lots of good reasons to restore ecosystems. But my third point is to say that there is currently a great deal of discussion about restoring ecosystems or nature-based solutions as a solution to the coal problem. And I am struggling with this. Lots of people are struggling with this. What this basically means is large-scale reforestation, industrial tree plantations, monoculture tree plantations, which grow quickly and pull in the carbon, and therefore can justify coal use at current rates of use. There's a recent report from the Energy and Resources Institute, which used to be called the Tata Energy Research Institute in India, that says that they could justify something between 2.5 and 3 billion tons of carbon simply through reforestation programs. Okay, now my point is that this is buying time. It's not really dealing with coal. It's not really dealing with all those multiple things I've listed before. But also there's a whole host of additional problems with large-scale nature-based solutions. If you have a large part of India covered with trees, then what's going to happen to the land in those areas? You know, what's going to happen to the agriculture? What's going to happen to the people there? There's all sorts of questions which are not factored in when people talk very glibly about how industrial uses of carbon can be offset very easily and cheaply by doing it with trees. It doesn't really add up in practice. And we need to be very critical of this. And indeed, one of the things that has been going on recently under the current Conservative government in Britain is a tendency to talk about trees. If you listen to Boris Johnson, he talks a lot about the trees as part of his plan, but actually there's a lot of controversy about the trees, which he isn't mentioning. And I think we need to make it more transparent. The bottom line is we need to do more about coal, and simply criticizing India for saying we're not going to phase out coal isn't good enough. There needs to be a more coordinated attempt at various levels to help India and other countries get off coal. That's my main point. Thank you.
So Tim Forsyth, I found that fascinating. Just to recap, if I've got this right, is that several decades ago, there was an agreement to do a technology transfer, i.e. sort of transfer in order that they could get alternative forms of energy, and that didn't happen. Is that right?
In loose terms, yes. I mean, in the Climate Change Convention, one of the clauses in it is that in order for this agreement to go ahead, the developed countries will help the developing countries get access at below market rates to clean technology. Now, there's been all sorts of little steps, but there hasn't been a real progress on it.
And give us an idea of what sort of technology transfer, what sort of alternative forms would have gone to India or Bangladesh or something like that they would have set up.
There could be multiple things. I mean, the most obvious ones are forms of energy efficiency. It's not necessarily alternative energy, but it means, for example, that you don't simply burn coal to generate electricity, but you might have combined heat and power so that you end up generating multiple things out of your same unit of coal, for example. But there are also other things. I mean, at the most extreme level, it could be nuclear energy. I mean, obviously that's a problematic thing. But it can also be extending things like renewable energies, which can either be large, big ones like geothermal plants, or small ones like wind turbines and solar panels and that sort of stuff.
So an agreement was signed and it wasn't implemented.
Well, it's all, there are multiple aspects of the Climate Change Convention which looked good in 1992, which actually haven't come to pass. There's all sorts of stuff going on in the Climate Change Convention which hasn't really been implemented. So yes, I mean, if you take it to the letter of the law, yes, it was signed, it was agreed, and it hasn't been implemented. But it is also reasonable to look back and be a little bit critical of what was written at that time. My point is that even though it is right to be critical of it, there still hasn't been enough discussion or progress. And
it hasn't been revised and updated, and people haven't said, no, we've really got to make this work.
Well, there have been little steps here and there along the way.
I'm just thinking, we as sort of laymen that read about this and are told not to fly and not to change electric cars, and are then told that China and India are the big evil ones because they haven't signed this thing at COP26 about coal. In fact, there's a whole lot of underlying issues there. As we've heard on the water debate and all of the underlying issues, it is far more complicated than just what we see in the headlines.
Alex Sharma was trying to blame India and China without taking responsibility for what the richer countries are doing about technology transfer.
Yeah. And just one last one before I open out to the panel, because we've got a few minutes with the question, is if coal production suddenly stopped, because there are fossil fuels still coming out of the ground, other fossil fuels, how much would that resolve the climate situation, the 1.5 degrees?
That's a difficult one for me to answer. I think the best I can do is to say a lot.
A lot. Okay.
But you know,
okay, right. Now we have got about 10 minutes or so left before we go to Barry Gardner, and a question has come in, if I can find it here, which is quite a general one. So I'd like to, but it's interesting. Does the panel believe that peace should be placed at the center of climate change responses, both in South Asia and globally? And given that we've talked about the crisis or non-crisis, we've talked about water, environment, and we've talked about water wars and that sort of thing, I wonder if panelists, as we go round again, could answer it as they interpret that question. Shalini, Dhyani, could you answer that first for us?
Thank you for this question. I think the last COP of climate was centered on climate justice. So I think if peace is to be required in the center of climate changes, it's important that we understand that human rights and climate justice should be very much part of these discussions, whatever we are having on water, on loss of forest deforestation, land degradation, and so many other extreme climate events. So if peace is kept in the center, that means the entire global international dialogues that are happening need to acknowledge the human rights issues and also especially the climate justice issues, because putting a strong emphasis and declaring, especially, for example, India is one of the top polluters in the world, is very unjustified. Every country has got enough and should get enough of chances to develop. And if you see the kind of, how my previous panelist has also stressed upon, like if you talk about the carbon budgeting and also the life of carbon in the environment, I think, yes, there should be more discussions on understanding this entire issue with a better lens of human rights and better lens of climate justice. And keeping peace in the center of this entire discussion can definitely bring in more peace and more adaptive solutions for the entire world, and also Asia. And that's why there is a more discussions required on climate financing, because peace, climate justice, and human rights can only be answered if all the marginalized communities and the countries that are underdeveloped and developing, who are doing their own efforts to conserve their resources for ensuring that we have a significant amount of these stocks protected, to ensure that we are sequestering enough of carbon in the environment. There should be enough emphasis on climate financing, climate justice, and should be very much be addressing to the question that talks about putting peace in the center of climate discussions.
Peace, and climate justice. Tempa Gyaltsen Zamlha, you are on the roof of the world, where water and climate has that sort of frightening nexus. Should peace be at the center of all the discussions? Is that the right word?
Absolutely. That is what is required at the moment. If there's a sense of peace and if there's a push for peace, I think there could be climate cooperation and also repairing cooperation that initially we said about the cooperation among the countries in Asia who received Tibetan rivers can cooperate. The inability to cooperate is lack of peace, sense of peace, a sense of insecurity of the geopolitical scenario existed in South and Southeast Asia. So, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama has repeatedly stated that a sense of peace, if it prevails, then there can be a cooperation. If there's a cooperation, then there's definitely understanding and adjustment where we can achieve the agreements that have been signed or agreed at different UN climate summits. So it's basically a lack of peace of mind, a sense of peace that is pushing each one to to put their interests ahead of the global interests.
Thank you. And I'm just wondering, Sumit Vij, as we discuss, is peace the right word, or given what we've been hearing about equality, social justice, or injustices, is there a more encapsulating phrase that should be at the center of this debate? Sumit Vij?
Yeah, I must say it's very difficult to deny that you need peace. I agree with that, but I think we have to really break it down, because peace for someone may also means not so much peace for some other one. So I think that also becomes a big challenge, and I think that's what is going on, especially what Professor Tim Forsyth was mentioning. This whole global north versus global south, the NX1 and the non-NX countries are struggling on the climate negotiations. So I think, for me, if you ask me, I would really place. We need to really break down this concept of peace. I think we need to break it down into conflicts and cooperation. We need to look into strategies, tactics of how we transform these conflicts into cooperation. That would be one thing. I think we can also look into how we bring the water and climate governance issues, break it down further into specific sectoral issues of what Dr. Naho Mirumachi was mentioning, specifically about focusing on agriculture sector for that matter in South Asia, because it's very contextualized. Again, to expand a bit more on what Professor Tim Forsyth was mentioning, each country, he was mentioning both India and China was kind of on the spot, kept on the spot for this whole climate negotiation. But I think both India and China are also quite different in that way. For India, India is really running on a thin ice right now. If you look at the prices of coal, in the last 2 years, it has increased by 200%. And we don't produce good quality coal, which is used for producing electricity in India. So I think that we are really running on thin ice. So we have to also think of quick alternatives on that front. So I think, and absolutely correct, 13 million people are currently directly or indirectly involved on the livelihood of coal. So we have to also think on that. I think it's very, very complicated, but I think we need to really break down the concept of peace when we're talking about governance of resources, natural resources, and environment in India, or particularly in South Asia.
And also what Tim Forsyth also mentioned is that there's all this stuff going on that we, the public, don't really know about. So transparency should also be put in there, perhaps, too, or non-politicization, if that's possible at all. Naho Mirumachi, should peace be at the center of this debate?
I think this is a fantastic question, and I think many people would say, yes, peace is driving many of the environmental efforts now. So we see an emergence of debate around environmental peace building. One of the things that my research has actually started to point towards is it's great that you can drive environmental efforts around peace building. But one of the things that happens is that societies change, power relationships change, relationships between governments and its citizens change. And as a result, that peace you attained at the end of a project may not necessarily be maintained. So actually, the question is not just simply about peace, but how do you sustain that peace? And I think peace, and that's a really difficult question that requires a lot of monitoring, a lot of transparency, a lot of continual efforts in ensuring that there is a good focus on who is benefiting from these interventions and who is potentially losing out, therefore creating situations of peace and potential conflict.
Thank you. That's a great answer, and I'd like to now go to Kasia Paprocki on this. Who I've got a note down from what you were saying there about social inequalities. If you rebalance that, somebody loses and somebody wins from it. Is peace the right word? Is it achievable to have at the heart of this debate?
Yeah, I'm not opposed to the idea of peace, but I mean, I think just as you've sort of inferred already from my comments, I don't think that peace or a lack of peace is the biggest issue that we're confronting today. It's not clear to me that achieving peace helps us to address economic inequality. It's not clear to me that achieving peace helps us to address the legacies of empire. And to be perfectly frank, I think that attention to peace also kind of misdirects attention to these questions about securitization, environmental conflict, threats of refugees, which based on my own research are really sort of not only not the major issues that we need to be concerned with, but also exacerbate these threats by misdirecting attention to where the problems really are. So yeah, my answer to that question is no, peace should not be the primary concern.
That's great. So I can't just have you going away with no on the publication day of your book. So given the arc of this debate, where we've gone from water to glaciers to climate change to coal, is there a word that can be at the center of what we have to sort out here? Is there something that we should focus on globally that would actually say, yes, that's why we have to do this, whether it's a stream in a village, whether it's somebody selling coal in another village, or whether it's Britain blaming China and India for making their voters believe that these countries are responsible for the climate change?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the word that I like to use is justice. I think that attention specifically to economic justice helps us to think about many different scales of inequalities that are sort of exacerbated by the problems related to climate change. I think that's everywhere from sort of the global scale. I mean, what Tim's talking about is fundamentally an issue of global economic injustice, right? That India deserves this kind of support and technology transfer from countries of the global north that already have the technologies, and that's both because of sort of inequalities in historical emissions, and also because, as I've said, the legacies of empire entitle India to these kind of technology transfers. And then I think that questions of economic justice also, when we're thinking about climate justice, look very different, but are also critical in these sort of local scale, village level politics that I've discussed myself.
Lovely, Kasia. That's great. And finally, to you, Tim Forsyth, on this peace question: should it be placed at the center of climate change responses, or should it be transparency, or is there a phrase or word that we could use?
So no, peace should not be at the center of the climate change negotiations. It's a complete distraction. Sustainable development should be at the center of the climate change negotiations. Of course, the question is how to do sustainable development, and that means looking at why people are vulnerable and working to reduce that vulnerability. And that also involves issues of justice. Peace? No, not really. I think that's a sideshow.
It is a distraction, and it'll bring in the wrong types of people for it. So the sustainable development, which would encompass all those issues that we've discussed about water, about climate, and the rest of that. And now we are going to go to Barry Gardner. I think you're with us, aren't you, Barry?
I am indeed.
Oh, brilliant. Now, Barry Gardner, whose sharp ears and eagle eyes has been on our discussion, and he's going to sum up the narrative arc of this debate, where we broke ground with it. And you have this particularly expertise, climate and environmental hat. So where should we all go from here, Barry?
Well, I feel rather like somebody who has been confronted with a Swedish smorgasbord and told that they have to turn it into a unified meal, because we've heard lots of contributions coming from different angles, from the roof of the world to coal power generation, a move back into the history of climate change negotiations, and I think what Shalini was talking about right at the beginning in terms of ecosystem services. So I want to start with I think, where there are some agreements, some threads that we can all agree on and draw together. And that is that we cannot see the climate crisis as a single thing divorced from biodiversity, and we cannot see the climate and ecological crises in biodiversity as distinct from the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think increasingly one of the things that I certainly took away from COP26 was that message of the unitary nature of the problems that we're dealing with is actually beginning to come through. I left COP26 alternating between complete despair and a certain degree of hopefulness. And I wanted to focus maybe on that question of peace that received some interesting answers. And I think where the question, as it were, went wrong was it saw peace as a driver. It's not. The causality goes in the other direction. And I think Tim really expressed that well at the end when he talked about sustainability. Because the key here is, if you want peace, create justice. And if you want justice, live sustainably. Because you cannot have peace if people feel that they have been unjustly or unfairly treated. That is going to lead to conflict. Whether it's hot conflict or cold conflict, it's going to lead to conflict. So if you want peace, create justice. And let me diverge off here for one of the important pieces on that smorgasbord that came through, which I think was from Kasia, where she talked about land rights, and she talked about the importance, particularly of indigenous land rights, and understanding the way in which they fit into the peace. And that really is important. And one of the most interesting shifts in the climate debate over the past decade, as I've been engaged within it for 20 years now, but for the past decade certainly, has been the work of people like Antonio Herman Benjamin in Brazil, the Supreme Court Justice there, and others who are talking about climate justice, who are talking about justice, who are talking about new laws in terms of ecocide. And that shift in looking at climate from the point of view of justice, I think is really important. But it was highlighted by Kasia when she was talking about the rights of indigenous peoples. And of course, that's critical when Tim was talking about forestation and the emphasis that is being put on reforestation and afforestation. I think we can link this up, because very often the problem in communities is that different legal rights obtain in these jurisdictions. And so if you take a country like Indonesia, there will be federal level rights which can be given away to mining countries to mine in a particular area. However, they're at local authority level, at regional level, and at local level, there are different legal structures which give the land rights to local communities, to forage or to do whatever in those communities, and rights over the forest and forest management. And these two are not properly integrated. And one of the really important moves, I think, that we need to make in the whole way in which we address climate change, and in the ways particularly in which wealthy nations are able to assist developing nations and the global south in these matters, is about tackling that basis of land rights and getting a unified structure in the legal system, and getting a proper legal framework where these things can be worked out. I have to say I disagreed with her over her points on shrimp aquaculture. Quite honestly, I thought that was a critique of what is a very outmoded framework of development. And if you look back into the TEEB reports that were coming out over a decade ago, if you look back even to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005, you'll see that the critiques were already there of shrimp aquaculture and these sort of imposed from the north development ideas as a way of improving livelihoods and addressing these issues. And you know, the push for mangrove as the nurseries for fish, as well as, of course, providing the proper coastal protection, takes us back into what Shalini was saying about ecosystem services and nature-based solutions. And, you know, I wanted to go back maybe to an example that everybody would recognize. Back in Hurricane Katrina, that was the one that hit New Orleans in 2005. And of course, the reason that Hurricane Katrina caused such devastation was that they had built through the meanderings of the Mississippi River at that point. They built a direct channel. It's called the Mr. Go channel, and that had cut through all the natural flow of the river, and it had induced increased salinification of the water there, and allowed the death of the Tupelo swamp. And the Tupelo swamp, these Tupelo trees, were the very thing that stopped surge swell for hundreds of years. And the interesting thing is the US engineering corps eventually had to rebuild the levees around New Orleans at a cost of $15 billion. But the only place where the levees were actually destroyed was where that Tupelo forest had been lost because of the change in the salinification of the water as a result of the man-made incursion for economic reasons, to speed shipping on its way down to the Gulf. So I think, you know, the integration of ecosystem services, the integration of nature-based solutions in the climate challenge is one that is absolutely fundamental. And when Tim was talking at the end about reforestation, and this is not the answer. No, indeed, it's not. But I think we have to be very careful here. It's certainly not the answer if what you're proposing to do is to have biomass product power stations like we have in Drax, where actually what you're doing is you're consuming huge, vast swathes of forested land in order to feed your power stations. That certainly is not a solution. But when he was talking about coal, there are real issues of justice here, but powering past coal and the No More Coal Coalition, the No New Coal rather coalition that was set up before COP26, not after it. It was set up before it. The end to coal was what COP26 was trying to achieve. But there, you have to look at what's happened in India. You know, Tim counseled us to look at the history in these things. The history, if you go back even just 6 years in India, was that India had in 2015 set up a target of producing, I think it was more, I think, than 200 new coal-fired power stations, of which about 10 or 12 have actually been built. And the reason they haven't been built is because they are not economical. And the investors are not there to build them because they cannot see a return on their investment. And the reason they can't see a return on their investment is not just because some politicians in Glasgow are about to, you know, sign a protocol that says that we won't go down that route. The reason they can't see a return on their investment is actually solar is so much more cheap than coal-fired power stations. If you look at the latest solar that's being produced in Saudi Arabia, you're talking about 1.02 cents per kilowatt hour. No coal-fired power station can match that. And so the shift, the balance, the economic shift that is taking place is that actually coal is no longer a suitable economic solution to the problems of power generation that we face. And increasingly, what is important, that was why one of the major announcements at the beginning of the COP was it was an initiative which I actually was responsible for putting forward to the Indian Prime Minister about 18 months ago. And that was to have a global green grid. So that what you do is you take the solar energy that is produced anywhere in the world and you enable it through interconnectivity to be utilized everywhere in the world. And that was one of the announcements that was made at the beginning of the COP. But perhaps the most important announcement that was made at the beginning of the COP was that by Mia Mottley in her opening speech, the Prime Minister of Barbados. And she so brilliantly articulated the way in which the global north has failed in its commitment to the global south, in not just in facilitating tech transfer, but she pointed out that in the past 18 months alone, we have spent $9 trillion worth of quantitative easing in order to get ourselves out of the pandemic. But we still have not been able to come up with a poxy 20 billion to complete the pledge that we made over 10 years ago, which was for 100 billion a year in the Global Climate Fund, to ensure that we were assisting those countries who needed that support to develop their own climate solutions. Sorry, you may hear a bell in the background, and I just need to check that it's not me being summoned for a vote. I'll have a quick look and see if I've been... no, I think that's all right. Humphrey, we're okay. Look, there is so much that we need to do in integrating our sustainable development goals, the Convention on Biodiversity, which similarly has been postponed. It's now going to be taking place in Kunming next year, and the outcomes of COP26. Technology transfer is a real issue, but so is loss and damage. And one of the real sticking points, the bottlenecks that successive COPs have faced, is that there has been a refusal by the global north to address loss and damage. And this is not addressing adaptation. So you have the three strands. You have mitigation, which is just the way in which we reduce our emissions. You have adaptation, and there needs to be a much greater balance between the funds that are available for mitigation and the funds that are available for adaptation. That should have been 50-50. It hasn't been. Enabling countries to adapt to changes in climate is vitally important. And again, we can go back to the Bangladesh points that were raised. And let's not forget that the Dutch have lived below sea level for hundreds of years on the coast of Europe. So it's not impossible to do, but you have to adapt. You have to adapt your situation to do it. And it's enabling countries to do that. But in some situations, there are things that it's not possible to adapt to. The increasing destruction of typhoons and cyclones and so on. Or if you're on Vanuatu or another small island developing state, there is a physical loss of land, such as was being referred to by Kasia as the sort of, threat theory or the over-the-top threat that climate change was posing as espoused by people. So it is possible to adapt, but there is also loss and damage. And this was the first time at COP26 that loss and damage has really been taken seriously, but not seriously enough. And we do need to move to a situation where there is a separate fund for loss and damage, as well as the Global Climate Fund, to enable the sorts of technological transfer and mitigation and adaptation measures to be undertaken. That brings me pretty much up to 4 o'clock, Humphrey, and there's so much else that we could say here. But I go back to that three-pronged, we have to have climate, biodiversity, and sustainable development goals as the three strands. If you want peace, create justice. If you want justice, live sustainably. And that's what it's about.
Thank you, Barry. But before you run off, I just wanted to with Tim Forsyth saying, is Britain wrong to put the responsibility onto Russia and China as the bad guys?
You're asking me?
No, I'm asking Barry to agree or disagree with you.
Okay, my view is simply this. Tim rightly referred to Rio, and he rightly referred to Kyoto Convention. It was superseded by Paris. In Paris, people gave undertakings, whether they were from China or whether they were from India. They gave undertakings that they would put their own contributions to make sure that they align their economies with well below 2 degrees and as closely aligned to 1.5 as possible. India's, if you look up on the climate tracker, India is highly insufficient. Its NDCs, its non-nationally determined contributions, are highly insufficient to get there, as are China's. China made a real progress in terms of coal by saying it would not fund, as it had been doing, new coal-fired power stations overseas. It did not make the same commitment for its own economy, which was I think a great shame, and they can be rightly hold over the coals, no pun intended for that. India was much worse, in my view, because it didn't actually take the opportunity that was presented to it to say, for us, it's much better to move to renewables. That's the way their economy will go naturally. It's exactly what is going to happen. And if they had been politically a lot shrewder, what they would have done is said, you know what, we're going to go to they exceeded their 400 gigawatt challenge. I think they came in at 500 or 550 gigawatts of renewables by 2030. That's where India is going economically. And they should have embraced that. They should have taken on the challenge of no new coal-fired power stations. They should have set a cutoff date for about 2025. And if they'd done that, politically, the gain that they would have made, and strategically, the gain they would have made vis-a-vis China, which is always a great question in India's politicians' mind, would have been enormous. They missed an open goal.
Right. Well, thank you for summing up that issue. Thank you, Barry Gardiner, very much. Thank you, panel, for your excellent contributions that really brought the debate on from water to social injustice to history, colonial reparations, to the roof of the world and the edges of the Indian Ocean and that. And thank you, audience. Thank you for those great questions about peace and everything, and for being involved and for joining us. Next month in 2022, January the 19th at 2 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, Democracy Forum is going to turn its eyes back to Afghanistan, a global humanitarian crisis. Please join us then, and if you haven't already, read our sister magazine, Asian Affairs, which takes you into topics and areas that other magazines do not. And this, if you can see it, has just landed on my doorstep. China versus the World, Recalibrating Global Politics. It's a synopsis and a wrap of Democracy Forum debates over the past year or so on this topic. That is a fascinating read. And until then, until January the 19th, from me, Humphrey Hawksley, and the team at Democracy Forum, have a great holiday season, stay safe, stay involved, and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.